leave or enter the room, please use the back door. And now we start with the next session with Rosana Costa will be the moderator.
Now? Okay. We are back again. We have the second panel. We have distinguished panelists here with me for answering about monetary policy challenges in time of economic policy uncertainty. We have here Ida Wolden Bache, governor of the Norges Bank. She has been since 2022 in the Norges Bank, so she has been at the forefront navigating monetary policy in this moment. We have also Agustín Carstens, a friend of Chile. He was a former general manager of the BIS. He was also governor of the Bank of Mexico, Minister of Finance, and so on. Thank you both for being here. And also José Luis Escrivá, just arriving from the airport. Thank you also for being here, governor of the Bank of Spain, and also he had an extensive experience on fiscal and monetary policy. So I will start giving all of you some minutes to speak to us about and to tell all of us what are you thinking about this moment and the challenges on monetary policy. And then we are going to answer some questions. First, I have 2 rounds of questions, if time permitted, or 1 time of question, and then I will give the floor to the audience. I will start with Agustín.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rosana, for inviting me to this panel and inviting me to this conference. It's good to be back with central bankers. I miss you. Let me start also by congratulating the Central Bank of Chile for its 100th anniversary. I mean, it's obvious that any central bank that makes it for 100 years, it has done many very good things. I also have to say that I have a soft spot for the Central Bank of Chile because the interaction with Banco de Mexico has been very fluent. And as a matter of fact, our autonomy law was inspired by one of the Central Bank of Chile. And as a matter of fact, the former governor was the advisor, Andres Bianchi. So when I was young, and I used to work with them in crafting this law. So it has always been a model to follow. So I think this is a great conference. It's a very good intersection between research and contemporary policy debates. And I guess what we have to do in this panel is to add on to this, and mostly including the contemporary policy debates. I would say that the title of the panel is Challenges for Monetary Policy. I would say it's, in general, we can interpret this as challenges for central banks. At the end of the day, you cannot segregate specifically what is what, and at the end of the day, the main mandate is monetary policy, and this gets affected in very different ways. Now, I remember here coming to conferences at Central Bank of Chile, oftentimes with my friend Klaus, many years ago when we were debating how backward or inappropriate our monetary policy frameworks were in the Latin American region. But as John recognized, we have made substantial progress, and I think now we can debate issues other than the appropriateness of our monetary policy frameworks. And I definitely, I'm very proud of the fact that with the GFC and even the recent COVID-related and war-related inflation spike, Latin America fared quite well. In general, I would say that when the US interest rates would be cranked up, Latin America, one or more Latin American countries went through the windshield. most of the time starting with Mexico. That happened in 82, in 94. We broke the trend in 2008 and 9 when there was not necessarily an interest rate hike, but a financial stability shock, and most recently with the COVID pandemic. So I think that is a testimony to the fact that we have made very important progress in establishing monetary policy frameworks in Latin America. Now, that doesn't mean that we are home free, that we don't face any risks and challenges. So I have identified 6 issues that I think central banks should concentrate in the future that reflects the challenges that I think are the most salient ones. First is the central bank autonomy is under attack in many countries and might be under attack in the future. The combination of politics, limited fiscal space, and low potential growth or sustainable growth, all of these are elements that are in a way acting towards asking why from a society point of view we should have a policy concentrated in preserving price stability. This is a very important challenge. I think that the recent inflationary spike is a good reminder that it's important to have an institution within the state mandated with preserving price stability. But that battle is not won. What can we do? Well, I would say at the end of the day, central banks should focus on their main mandate and assure the compliance of the main mandate. I think that during the last decade or more, probably we were distracted with some issues under the belief that inflation had been conquered. And I don't think that was, I mean, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, that probably should not be repeated. And I think that we should really deliver in our mandate. We need to be very jealous of our mandate, and I think that's important. The second aspect, which in a way is also part of more of the, not so much policy, but is the institution aspects, is what I would say we need to prevent the institutionalization of money. And what do I mean by this? I think that we are moving into a world, I mean, in a way I have to say the horse is out of the barn, where we will need what we basically understand by money, central bank money and commercial bank money now will have to coexist with private issued money, mostly in the form of stable coins. Now the big difference between a stable coin and the other 2 types of money is that it's very technologically advanced, a stable coin, but it doesn't have any institutional backing. In most cases, not even regulation. The big challenge will be how are we going to converge and make them equivalent, and that we will have singleness of money in those respects. From I would say, traditional money, central banks and commercial banks, they definitely need to up their game dramatically to bring all the technology that is needed today to make their currencies competitive, their money competitive. And on the other hand, we need to bring a much stronger institutional framework for stable coins. If we don't succeed in this, we are just buying huge problems into the future, and I have the sense that we are lagging behind. Third, I think it will be a challenge of global fiscal imbalances. The direction and speed on which public debt is increasing is frightening. And I also, what for me is more frightening is that there is not really an important public debate about it. I mean, since advanced economies mostly have been able to increase their debt without much reflection in the markets, that has, the debate is not there. Now, for central banks, it's very hard to assure that monetary policy and fiscal policy will not be working at crossroads. It also affects the possibility or the challenges for central banks on a from financial stability point of view. I think central banks need to make clear that they cannot be the antidote of fiscal imbalances. The fourth is that I also think that risk for financial stability has increased. Non-bank financial intermediation plays a very important role. There are new forms of financial intermediation, depending a lot on maturity transformation, maturity mismatches, excess leverage, and to some extent an over-dependency on central banks playing the role of lender of last resort or market maker of last resort. I think here is also an area where we need to up our game. Fifth, central banks and authorities in general has to invest far more in technology. DLT, cloud tokenization, artificial intelligence, big data is changing dramatically the way economics and financial markets are performing. Do we have the capacity to supervise and regulate markets as they are? No. Do we fully understand how will this transform transmission mechanisms of monetary policy? It's an open question. My sense is that we are falling behind. If you compare how much investment is out there in commercial banks, but also in fintechs, in big tech, and so on, and how much are we investing in making our capacities to run, at least not to lose ground against reality, it's really scary, you know. As a matter of fact, many central banks, they are not investing a lot. Some central banks are reducing their budgets on supervision. For me, this is really, really threatening. We just have been experiencing big challenges in the payment space and what money is. And do we have an answer from a technological point of view? And I would say today we don't have an answer. So I think that we need to invest in it. To save money on technology is a completely counterproductive austerity illusion. And finally, we need to keep alive international cooperation and collaboration. With this world into the future, my sense is that the possibility is that we will have more accidents and that the global safety net needs to be enhanced. I think this is very important. Again, all of this comes together. One of the aspects of technology and the way stablecoins is evolving is that also the way we understand today monetary policy and financial markets is in a way contained in a sovereign. But now all these stablecoins are part of the cyberspace. They don't have nationality. And I think the sovereignty is something important. I think we need to preserve it. A lot needs to be done. But also more collaboration and cooperation will be needed. And I think that is something that we have to work on. Thank you.
Great points. Thank you, Agustín. And long points too. Aida, 3 minutes for your approximation to the challenges.
Well, I took too much time, sorry.
No.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and
take your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this great conference, and it's an honor to be here to celebrate the centennial of the Central Bank of Chile. Although Norway and Chile are far apart geographically, we have many things in common. We are both major fishing nations. Both our countries are long and narrow, close to polar regions. And our economies have been shaped by abundant natural resources, copper here in Chile and oil and gas in Norway, which part of those revenues have been channeled into sovereign wealth funds, helping us smooth commodity cycles. But as fortunate as we may have been in this respect, we are still small, open economies with fairly limited production bases, leaving us exposed to global shocks and international developments. And of course, in recent years, we have certainly felt the impact of those shocks. So in these very brief remarks, let me reflect on how these shocks and how the broader global shifts that we are experiencing are reshaping the environment in which we conduct monetary policy and what that means for us as policymakers. Now, on the first question, as we heard John Williams explain earlier today, in the decade or so prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation was stubbornly low in many advanced economies. Policy rates hit zero or even below zero. We used instruments such as forward guidance and quantitative easing to compress long-term rates and risk premia. And the prospect of rapidly rising prices seemed very remote. And that assumption, of course, proved to be wrong. 2022 and 2023, inflation surged in many countries to the highest levels seen in decades. I think in hindsight, it is clear that our thinking and also our models and our judgments were shaped by the long period of low inflation. And we clearly underestimated how strongly the pandemic-related shocks on the supply side and the very expansionary policies would fuel inflation. And in small open economies like the Norwegian economy, we had quite a significant depreciation of our currencies on top of that, exacerbating the inflation problem, making the trade-offs in monetary policy even harder. So central banks around the world had to tighten policy rapidly, and some, like in Chile and many other Latin American countries, moved earlier and more forcefully than others. So looking forward, I think one thing we can be sure of is that the world will continue to surprise us. And I will remain very humble in my ability to predict future shocks. But forces such as climate change, geopolitical tensions, and the fast advances in artificial intelligence are contributing to uncertainty. And one conjecture is that at least some of these forces will result in larger and more frequent shocks on the supply side of the economy. And what follows from this? Well, first, and to emphasize what you said, Agustín, I think monetary policy should remain focused on the core of its mandate, which is keeping inflation low and stable. This does not mean a return to strict inflation targets, as most central banks have mandates that give way to employment and the real economy. But while flexible inflation targeting allows us, as it were, to look through temporary supply shocks, if we repeatedly accommodate a sequence of negative supply shocks, average inflation could be pushed above the inflation target, and we could risk the anchoring inflation expectations. And as many in this room would know, history shows that once confidence in price stability is lost, the costs can be very high. Second, and again echoing one of your comments, we should be realistic about what monetary policy can and cannot achieve. For example, monetary policy affects the economy broadly. It cannot be used to target specific sectors or groups of households. And some policy objectives require more targeted tools. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, targeted fiscal support helped those sectors and those households that was most hard hit by the shutdowns and the weak demand. Another example is climate change. So although both the physical effects of climate change and the transition to a low carbon economy have implications for the economy and therefore also for monetary policy, the policy rate is not an efficient tool to support that transition. And third, we must never forget the importance of preserving public trust in our institutions. And in an environment of heightened uncertainty, it is even more important for central banks to clarify the reasons behind our actions and how they are affected by new information. Now, in Norway, we celebrate our own anniversary this year. It's been 20 years of publishing our own policy rate forecast alongside forecasts of other variables. And in each monetary policy report, we also describe how that forecast is affected by incoming information. That does not mean that this policy rate forecast is a promise, and that is widely understood by financial market participants. And it has indeed been adjusted substantially in recent years as a response to changing economic conditions. We nevertheless still believe that this is a useful communication tool. But we're also thinking of ways to improve our communication. And we have observed that many central banks are now increasing the use of scenarios in their communication. And I do think that well-designed and well-thought-through scenarios could help markets and the public understand how policymakers might react to shocks that have not yet occurred. I also believe that regular reviews of monetary policy frameworks provide a valuable opportunity both to take on board new insights, but could also increase the democratic legitimacy of our policy frameworks and thereby increase support for independent monetary policy. Now, earlier this year, the Norwegian government initiated a review of the Norwegian monetary policy mandate. I will not preempt any conclusions from that evaluation, but other than to say that I believe that a good monetary policy mandate should be flexible enough for us to address different kinds of disturbances and not just those who have happened in the recent past. But I think at the same time, they should be precise enough to enable the public to hold us to account. So let me conclude. Uncertainty is nothing new. Central banks have always had to adapt to shifting conditions, and transparency and a commitment to price stability remain the foundation for navigating the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Very insightful words. Very good. Thank you, Aida. José Luis, how do you navigate in monetary
thank
policy?
you, Rosanna. And I am also very pleased to be here today. 100 years are a lot of years. And I just was remembering that probably I was visiting you maybe nearly 35 years ago. I mean, I had been regular, I have also a lot of years, regular visitor of the central bank on many occasions. So I'm very pleased, and also to see familiar faces. I just met Vittorio Corvo in the corridor, so I'm really pleased to be here and to see these faces. Okay, I concur very much on what my colleagues have said. I will try to be primarily complementary, but this does not imply that I fully subscribe what they said on quite a number of substantive issues. Central bankers, we have been all the time struggling with uncertainty and with non-linearity. Basically, the major problem we face is that our toolkit is primarily linear. The instruments we use are linear in nature, but the reality is non-linear. And sometimes in a very acute manner. And seems to me, but this is debatable, that I think we are moving to a world which is even more non-linear. I mean, not only in terms of level, but also in terms of variance. We see how periods of high volatility are followed by periods of much more stable situation, change in trends, shocks that probably are in size much larger than in the past. And I think also we are confronted with a sort of, at present at least, with a sort of Nantian uncertainty, meaning, I mean, COVID might be just the opposite. In the COVID, it was quite easy to figure out a counterfactual scenario in the absence of our monetary and fiscal policies and the potential outcomes, at least in terms of direction. Now, with some of the shocks that we may face in the future, or we identify in our potential emerging, it's far more difficult to pinpoint ex ante the direction of the shock, the impact of inflation, the impact on activity, all the more in terms of timing. So when this 90th uncertainty, I think we need even to work more internally, and I think I should to be humble that the instruments we are using regularly in making forecasts, in making scenarios, might have significant limitations looking forward. I think also,
Sorry.
never mind. I think we need also to enhance our robustness instruments. Because of this situation of 90th uncertainty, we cannot rely, we cannot continue working in a central scenario based on a workhorse model. We need to supplement what we are doing with satellite instruments, make robustness, both in terms of data sets, in terms of models, and combining all these elements, analytical elements, is an art. It's not easy at all, but it's unavoidable that we do so and recognize the complexity of the world that we are confronting, but also that the models we are using have this limitation. I think this is something we need to struggle. And new techniques, I think we need to invest more on research. I think that neural models and new techniques could allow us to work more in a non-linear way, in a way or another. I think we need to work central bankers very much and foster research in these directions, making use of high frequency data and be able to filter them to capture all these nonlinear patterns. I think there is a lot of work to be done, but I think there's a good sense of awareness that we do so. And finally, I would say that in focusing, continue on this uncertainty, this phase is not only an analytical challenge, but also a challenge in something that sometimes is not sufficiently discussed in our reviews of the strategy, regular reviews of the strategy, which is the way we in the monetary policy committees make decisions, how we really build consensus among us, how we get information and we are processing them and trying to come to conclusions or discrepancies. Seems to me that this is also something that needs to be worked in terms of how all this material, complex material, is presented to the monetary policy committees, in what format, and how we are really making our decision process. Seems to me that is something that sometimes is overlooked. Seems to me this is very important and increasingly relevant. And my third point is on communication. Communicating uncertainty has always been a challenge. Communicating with the scenarios, we come back to that point if you wish, is not easy because basically at the same time we want to show central bankers in steering expectation that we are on top of the issues, that we really are on top, that in order to gear expectations, but if at the same time there is a sense of recognition that there are limits in what we know now, it might be understood in a wrong manner. So how to communicate the limits of our knowledge to the public at the same time that we are announcing our monetary policy decisions is to me also challenging at the current stage. Thank you.
Thank you, José Luis. Agustín, you mentioned 6 great challenges. One of them is commonly less mentioned. You mentioned the importance of international cooperation. How do you see that international organization can help, and how they could coordinate? What do you think about this?
Well, first of all, it's very important to keep the dialogue going. I think here 2 key institutions are the BIS and the IMF. I think that the work we do in the BIS is great. oldest international financial institution in the world. It's going to be 100 years quite soon. I think the dialogue that we have there is very much of the essence, because it's frank, it's open, it's respectful from the mandates of the different countries. It's always, and we just cannot make it disappear, the fact that important players have their own mandates, and at the end of the day, politics is domestic and monetary policy is one of them, and we cannot go around it. But that doesn't take away that there might be scope for further enhancing the roles of different institutions. I think that the institution that we have in the world to provide financial assistance is the IMF. And let's be very honest, the IMF has been lagging behind in terms of its firing power with respect to the size of markets, to the size of capital flows, with the opportunity where some resources are needed. I think that the construct of the IMF is it's ingenious, it's great, because it sort of breaks the bilateral dimension between a strong country and a weak country. It puts an institution in the middle. It facilitates conditionality, you know. Now, I think that we need to enhance this. I also think that in some regions of the world, they need to self-insure even more, you know. I mean, for example, now that for example, you know, the dependency on dollars for financial intermediation, it might even grow faster. Some regions of the world might not have enough stocks of dollars to face different challenges. So some countries have to probably be more active in terms of identifying what are the type of challenges they need, and therefore be better prepared. I mean, I think the collaboration of policy debate, I think, is there. It can be enhanced, but I think by and large is good. The issue of global safety net is something that we probably need to work more. Also trying to anticipate, you know, how the international financial markets are evolving.
Thank you.
May I add something? I mean, on this, because I think this is extremely important issue. And I would say that to supplement what Agustín has said with two remarks. One is, there are also reasons to be concerned about also G20 institutions. Not only, remember that after the financial crisis, the G20 was created, the Financial Stability Board. It was a very bold response. I think we have benefited from that. Seems to me that the momentum that was present at that time, 15 years ago, we are losing this momentum at present. And G20 and the G20 institutions had a very good perimeter in integrating, let's say, the globality in the world. But now my sense is that this momentum is not any longer there, and this is a matter for concern. And if this is the case, and also what Agustín said at the IMF, seems to me, since some of the issues that Agustín mentioned are so pressing and needs response also collectively at the level of central bank and financial regulators and supervisors, I would say that there is not one term that is used in Europe increasingly over time, which is the coalition of the willing. So at a certain point, if global institutions are not at the stake, I mean, they really are not at the level that needed to confront these challenges, I think a number of central banks, institutions should work together anyway. Recently, I had been last week actually in Asia, and I have seen in Asia a number of initiatives in the area of payment systems, for instance, instantaneous payment systems and cross-border payments which are very much an example of that, of coalition of the willing, 5, 6 central banks working together, putting resources, pooling resources, because some of the issues that Agustín mentioned requires resources, investments that cannot be done in isolation at the national level.
Okay, Aida, as you mentioned, Chile and Norway has many similarities, both small open economies. I would like to ask you, how does the government pension fund global influence Norway's fiscal space and the interaction between fiscal and monetary policy in your country? How do you see that?
Well, let me first say that our sovereign wealth fund, which is the Government Pension Fund Global, it's a very complicated name, was set up in the 1990s precisely to accumulate the surplus revenues from our oil and gas extraction on the continental shelf. And over the past decades, subsequent governments have set aside significant revenue so that the fund is now some 5 times our non-oil economy. So it obviously does provide a substantial fiscal buffer. In terms of monetary policy, there's no direct relation. Fair to say that the fund is actually managed by the central bank. But as a central bank, we have no say in the use of the money from the fund, obviously. So that's for the fiscal authorities to decide. And they have a fiscal policy rule according to which they can spend the expected real return on the fund to cover the budget deficit every year, which is estimated at 3%. So obviously there's a significant fiscal buffer that could be useful as a stabilization tool in severe downturns, or if monetary policy has no more room to maneuver. It also makes it easier, of course, to accommodate increased military spending and other needs. But I would like to say that the fact that we have this very large fund does not make us immune to shocks in any way. Obviously, we were facing the same demographic shifts as other countries, and again, the need to increase military spending. But more than that, we, being a large global investor, the value of the fund is, of course, very sensitive to changes in global financial markets. So if we were to see a sharp and not only a very short-lived decrease in global equity prices, then that, of course, would reduce the value of the fund significantly. And over time, that would affect fiscal policy with the potential need to tighten fiscal policy considerably. So we have shifted from being vulnerable to commodity prices. Now we're more dependent on global financial markets, as it were. So I think it's still the essence to maintain sound institutional frameworks and prudent fiscal policy despite having this very valuable buffer.
Thank you, Aida. José Luis, you spoke a little about adaptation, central banks' need of adaptation. How should central banks adapt to this high uncertainty or this new normal?
Okay, they need to, or we are already enhancing our toolkit. I mean, this is a process. It will take time. We need to be very much open to techniques and approaches. Also, we have to be to work more on gathering high-frequency data and make use of them more intensively for not nowcasting, but also in understanding developments of more micro-analysis supporting our more traditional macro models. I think that we need to work more on scenarios, as it has been discussed recently in different fora. This is challenging not only because of the models to be used, because some scenarios need to represent the states of the economy for which we may not have the right instruments, or the transmission mechanisms are not well identified in the existing instruments. So it's a challenge on that. But seems to me that another challenge, which sometimes is somewhat overlooked, is the following. we had been in an inflation targeting framework. We have been working under the following model. The staff of the central banks produces the forecast, and this is the staff forecast, and this is presented to the policymakers for, yes, as the main benchmark. And we may agree or not, or we may be differences, but this is the ownership is of the forecast. And this is the central scenario. If we increasingly move in the direction of combining the central scenario with alternative scenarios, and the reason is because we believe that the likelihood to be attached to the central scenario is diminishing somewhat, and we need other scenarios, maybe not as likely, but with a significant likelihood of materializing. The challenge here is who is selecting these scenarios? Is it the staff? It is the policymakers? How many scenarios? How they are designed? So all this is not easy. And in the way we'll decide, it may also impact on the ownership issue of some of the elements that we have. I think, to me, this is not resolved. And then another instrument we need to, and I'm now going a little beyond monetary policy and more financial stability, because there is always interlink between monetary policy and financial stability that probably ex ante is conceptually well decoupled, but on some occasions is so much intertwined. So for financial stability purposes, but in general for understanding potential risk scenarios, we need to work more in stress tests. What I think, the stress test instruments that were developed actually after the financial crisis are still not as sophisticated to me as they should. And I think they were more, had been planned more for micro supervision, but the use for macro, in order to assess risk to financial stability on a macro level, would require rethinking of the stress tests in ways that at present are only somewhat underdeveloped. That's another avenue I think we should pursue.
Thank you. Now I'm going to open the floor for questions in the audience. Quickly questions, immediately. I'm start here. Elias, Ricardo, and here.
Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. It's a real privilege to listen to these ideas and remarks. It seems that looking ahead, the challenges are particularly significant. Not only because the second moments in the economy are going up, I think there's agreement on that. The first question I would like to ask you is whether you also agree that the other policy that used to be combined with monetary policy for dealing with these second moments, which is fiscal policy, has less space, and whether that means that monetary policy has to take more of the burden. So higher variance and a higher reliance on monetary policy related to fiscal policy. And if there's agreement on that, how do we do it? Right? So one extra tool, which is QE, quantitative tools, have this problem of potentially being mixed with fiscal dominance concerns. Seems to me the other policy that has been discussed here has to do with communication and how explicit, how formal we become at communicating whether the central forecast, alternative scenarios, and so on. Seems to me there's less discussion on that, and there's definitely less agreement on banks. Banks have widely different strategies. The governor was mentioning the case of Norway. A lot of bells ring in terms of the similarities with what we do in Chile, but it seems to me that these are like exception countries. So I don't know, having your feedback on that would be really insightful. Thanks.
Ricardo.
Yes, it was a great panel, and let me make 2 comments more than 2 questions, and they become questions if you disagree. And these are comments on markets. I think the main, my perception at least, is the main agent with which you have to communicate is not the household, it's financial markets. And financial markets are very opinionated. They have their own views about things, and They not always think that central banks do the right thing. So in that context, I think for communication issues and for a scenario analysis, the most important thing is not the probabilities you assign to those scenarios. What is the most important thing for the market is first that you acknowledge that the scenarios they're worried about exist. And second, they want to know how will you react to those scenarios they give a lot of weight, not necessarily the ones you give a lot of weight. And I think that's once you take into account that markets disagree with you, you need to think a little bit differently about a scenario formulation and so on. The second point is related to night and uncertainty. I love night and uncertainty, and I think I'm absolutely in agreement that we are in a situation in which that's very present. But the markets are not behaving as if we had night and uncertainty. And one of the most difficult shocks a central bank can face is when the markets do realize that we live in a world of financial uncertainty. So I think a little bit the realization that we live in a world where night and uncertainty is justified, but the fact that the markets at these moments are not realizing that, it also leads to planning. You need to have some sort of strategy to deal with the night and uncertainty in the market if that were to emerge. Thank you.
Good. I have a very specific question to Agustín. In the list of 6, you had smart coins. So I fully understand the implications of smart coins for regulation and supervision issues. Do you have a view as to how smart coins changes the way you think about monetary policy, narrowly defined, namely the use of the policy rate?
Stephanie.
Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. Follows on very nicely from Olivier. I thought that Agustín raised very clearly the issue of deinstitutionalization of money and the implications this has for, I suppose, monetary policy, but also for financial stability. And I was wondering if he could elaborate a little bit more his thoughts on how that could be dealt with by, particularly by emerging economies, but also more broadly, by countries who are basically policy takers, because most of the decisions are being taken elsewhere. And how do you manage, regulate, and institutionalize this? Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to answer in the same order. Agustín?
Okay, the first question, I mean, in a way, the way you phrased your question sort of implies that we should consider how to optimize the stabilization role of fiscal and monetary policy. And at some point in that narrative, there is more probably slack, as you said, that need to be cut by monetary policy. For me, what should be done is for us to rely less on fiscal and monetary policy to, more than anything, to affect the path of economic growth and sustained economic growth. I mean, if you look into the last 20 years, I think we have had an over-dependency of fiscal and monetary policy. And the real problem is very low rates of economic growth. There are many countries that are suffering very, very important slowdown in productivity growth. And our debate is trying to solve, I mean, it's like you have a fundamental critical issue in your health and you're trying to solve it with very transitory and not sustainable policy or treatments. And the problem that, at least from my point of view, is that both fiscal and monetary policy are running out of space. I mean, with the level of debt to GDP where it is today, how many more shocks can we face into the future? And then the issue of monetary policy, our credibility has been affected really substantially by this hiccup of inflation. We will have the same leeway of just open the gates, the floodgates, as we did in the post-pandemic. Will it have the same stabilization effort? No. I mean, obviously those instruments are there and they should be used. But my point is that over-dependency on them questions their effectiveness. In particular, when we are not dealing with the issue of growth. As a matter of fact, the policies that are implemented in the world, many of them are going against growth. Trade policy, I mean, that is not contributing to growth, you know. So I think we need to re-enhance the debate on growth. We need to understand much better the supply side. I think many of the problems we faced were supply side shocks. And I think the debate should concentrate more on that. Financial markets, I agree with you. I think one very important thing that we need to understand, that for me I think it's a big challenge, is that financial markets are depending more and more and more about what central banks and authorities might do when things do not go well. And this is the issue of lender of last resort and market makers of last resort. I think a lot of strategies are, I mean, we are providing a safety net, and I think that invites risk-taking. And for me, that's probably the main challenge that we need to address as central banks. Stablecoins, there are many ways in which it can affect the monetary policy transmission mechanism. I mean, one is how will it affect bank intermediation? Will there be an important substitution or displacement of resources from banks into stable coins? More in a way that is far more clearer and has to do with the question of Stephanie, is that it can affect, it can dollarize, in quotation marks, many economies. And it can be a completely involuntary dollarization, and that really can generate a currency substitution that can affect the exchange rate. And of course, that probably will have to trigger, a monetary policy response. The idea is how can we create a framework in which we can deal with these side effects. And the framework in many latitudes is absent. And I think we need to work towards it.
Ida, do you want to complement?
I can be very brief on monetary policy communication in terms that uncertainty has always been a feature of the landscape that central banks have had to navigate. And thinking about how to best communicate our policies and our reaction function has been an integral part of that, and we're continuing to develop that. And looking back at the past 5 years, I think we need to be even more humble in the way we communicate and our ability to predict and forecast the future. We need to remain very committed to what is our objective, but not become too overly precise in our communication. I think we need to rely on sound economic analysis, our economists' analysis, and taking advantage of new technology to understand the economy is getting even more important, but being humble and being realistic about what monetary policy can and cannot achieve, I think is even more important in this current environment.
José Luis?
Maybe I can try to address the questions by combining the two on fiscal, monetary policy, and markets somewhat. I think it's true that markets are at present attaching extremely low price to risks that on the public domain we feel are substantive. This is the divorce we are witnessing at present. It seems also to me that one of the reasons why the markets are so upbeat and might be partly related to the fact that building on what they have witnessed over the last decades, they expect that if one of these risks were to materialize, we are going to step in with fiscal and monetary policies to mitigate the effects, and the losses on the market will be lower than for that reason. In a way, this is endogenous. And I think that at a certain point, and I think this connects probably what Agustín said on fiscal policy, we should start making clear that this time around might not be the case, and that to the extent, and this is very important, that after the financial crisis, we have really devoted a lot of energy for having a world banking sector which is far more resilient than it used to be in terms of capital and supervision. Probably this time around, we can really simply, and this is the major risk for the transmission of shocks, I mean, through the banking sector, nationally or globally, to the extent that we have done a good work. Probably this time around, we would be in a position to accept that some of these corrections in the market materializes with no demand policies offsetting them, and probably the risk for financial stability would be far less than we have anticipated in the past. So in a way, I think this is a dynamic that at a certain point can be put on the table and might be healthy for, on the one hand, readjusting the risk profile of some investors to be more aware about some risky businesses and developments, and at the same time probably would be less of a burden to us in the future because we may focus more on our central policies and not trying to step in situations that sometimes is dubious, at least in terms of size, how much demand policy should go.
Thank you. Jordi and many hands there. You and there.
Okay, this is a question on economic research and monetary policy in practice. So about 15 years ago, it was very common to hear criticisms from policymakers about many aspects of the dominant macro models at that time. They lacked financial sector, financial frictions. They assumed rational expectations, which was unrealistic. And they assumed the representative agent, so no heterogeneity and so on. Now, I think since then, much work has been done along those lines in correcting those criticisms. And I think an important, in particular, an important development over the past decade or so has been the emergence of the so-called Hank models, models with heterogeneous agents. Now, that literature has shown that monetary policy has important distributional consequences, and that optimal monetary policy, the design of optimal monetary policy, unavoidably has to take those into account. So my question to you is, at the same time I hear that there is a call for focusing on the core business and so on of monetary policy. So to what extent these considerations, distributional considerations and so on, are significant for monetary policy in practice, or can they be completely ignored?
Thank you. Yeah. You, please.
I think it's my turn. So my question, thank you first for this wonderful session. My question is regarding communication. You guys and yesterday to talk about the merits of providing for the forward-looking guidance and perhaps transmitting your reaction function. And we understand there's a downside of tying yourself to one specific outlook, right? Of course, you can do the whole fan of scenarios, right? But one thing that I think it's one clever way that I think it's good, or that it's my perception, is what the BCB, the Banco of Brazil, does, which is saying to the market, okay, taking the projections of the market, including the FX, and saying, okay, during or based in these conditions, then my path for the rate would be X and Y, right? And so that makes the market that leads to the market understanding that if those conditions change, then the path would change as well. And my question is, what do you guys think about, going a step further and providing the market the base assumptions, including the effects on your projections? Thank you.
Yang.
Question for Agustín. It's about stable coin. The last week, Canadian government just gave Bank of Canada a new mandate as a regulator of stable coin for Canada. So I noticed you have given a number of speeches while you're in the BS and talking about tokenized unified ledger, which actually is a wonderful platform. You can incorporate central bank reserves, private money from commercial banks, as well as government bonds. So suppose such platform is really a future and it does exist. I wonder whether you have given some thoughts about who should govern such platform, who should be the one setting rules, and how this would affect monetary sovereignty of different countries. Thank you.
Thank you. The same order on each of you answer the corresponding question. Agustín.
I will try to be brief. Jordi, great question. I think distributional aspects are definitely taken more and more and more into account into calibrating your models for the effectiveness of monetary policy. Now, I think that the big step that it's a very open debate and probably more towards not asking monetary policy to mind the medium and long-term performance of the distribution of income. Monetary policy instruments cannot be an instrument to gear distributional aspects. I think that's a structural issue of the economy, and other policies are better off. Central banks cannot tie their hands based on distributional impacts in terms of, I'm concerned about this sector or that other sector, So, I mean, yes, we are working on it. Yes, I think that they affect the way monetary policy works, but it cannot be part of the objective of the central bank just because we don't have the instruments. The issue of communication and Forex, you mentioned the views of the Forex that central bank might have. Central banks usually do not have a view on Forex, particularly if it's a floating exchange rate. And I don't think there is no central bank that is willing to disclose that. I think that also would not be prudent to do that. In terms of stable coins and so on and so forth, first of all, I think it's great that the Central Bank of Canada got its mandate. I think it's a very realistic position. Again, as I said, the horse is out of the barn, and we need to address many of the issues that are open out there. One is the issue of sovereignty, and it's an open question from a technological and realistic point of view if it can be contained. There are very important issues that are debatable. I mean, for example, in the stablecoin world, there is no lender of last resort. For that, you have the backing. Now, if you have the backing, let's say, based in the US with US institutions, and you hold a US stablecoin in Canada, and that stablecoin goes under, how will be the resolution of that be played out? We don't have we don't have today a solution for that. So that is part of the cooperation and the institutional development that needs to be taken into account to first prevent financial stability consequences, but also to preserve what is so valuable, which is the singleness of money.
Thank you, Agustín. Aida.
I can follow up on the communication question, just to explain how we are thinking about this. So we have a floating exchange rate, so we do not have a target for the exchange rate, and we don't have a view about where the exchange rate should be. But of course, it matters a lot in a small open economy for output, for inflation. So of course, we monitor the exchange rate carefully, and we do also actually provide a forecast for the exchange rate. If you look at that forecast, you will see that it resembles very much a random walk, but it's still a forecast, and it's still the assumption on which we base our monetary policy decisions on. And so we also publish our policy rate forecast, and over time we have sort of reacted systematically to deviations of exchange rate from that forecast. So markets know how we will respond to changes in those assumptions. And we also, each time we publish a new policy forecast, decompose the change in that forecast into the different components. And then the exchange rate might matter a little or more depending on the situation. So that adds, I think, some of the clarity that you're referring to. On Jordi's question, I'll just assure you that we are taking these insights on board and that we are carefully into these models and being more aware of those consequences for our understanding of the transmission mechanism and how the economy works. But otherwise, I agree with my colleague.
José Luis.
Yes, three issues on redistributional effects of policies. I think this is a very tricky issue, and I tend to agree with Agustín. Just to give you an example of how we may deal with this issue in the Eurosystem, with a concrete example, I mean, we have agreed upon to have some decisions, for instance, in the way we design our collateral policy to interiorize climate risks. In a way, if you go very far away in these policies, this would have distributional effects, no doubt. So whenever we discuss this at the level of the Governing Council of the ECB, we tend to not to go very far away in inserting in our instruments elements that could deal with these issues by creating incentives in a way or another. The umbrella to do that could be, legally, in the case of the Eurosystem, the secondary objectives. I mean, it is stated in the treaty that, okay, our primary objective is price stability, but to the extent that price stability is preserved, we can do other things to support general policies in Europe. Okay, and this is distributional primarily when you do that. I mean, when you are confronted with concrete examples, I mean, it proves very difficult to basically reconcile the two things. So you can do modest things, but probably not too much. That would be my conclusion. On the second question, I think that in a Nantian world, and I very much believe that we are in that world, I would be very reluctant to provide forward guidance, and I would be very cautious on that. And then on stable coins, I mean, just to give you the ECB or Eurosystem perspective, actually, I'm coming from the Governing Council of the ECB. We met yesterday and the day before yesterday. We have a substantive discussion on these issues. And basically, our approach to this is the following. We feel that primarily in the area, one thing is retail payments, stable coins. I will also say something about that, but on wholesale payments and tokenized deposits and tokenized markets, I mean, we have two projects that we have decided to speed them up, which is Pontes and Appia. Pontes is a project in order to, in 2 years' time, provide in the Target 2 system, which is the settlement system of wholesale payments in Europe, to allow the insertion of external blocks in the financial system that are working under distributed ledger technologies and tokenized technologies. And Appia, it will take a little longer, is to a fully fledged wholesale settlement system in distributed layer technology. So basically the message here is, I mean, really these new technologies provide efficiency, are innovative, need to be integrated in the financial system in a very decisive manner, but we need to be on some, I would say, in retail money and in wholesale payments, the public domain need to be preserved. And this is basically the view in Europe.
Unfortunately, we have no time, no more time, so thank you very much to these three excellent panelists. An applause for them.
See to lunch. Remember that if you have a red dot in your badge, you are invited to the protocolar lunch.